I never thought much about storage units until last year. They're just these plain metal boxes where people dump their extra stuff, right? But after what happened to me, I can't even drive past one of those facilities without breaking into a cold sweat. This all started when my grandmother passed away. She'd lived alone for the last decade after my grandfather died, and when we were sorting through her affairs, we discovered she'd been renting a storage unit for years. None of us had any idea. The paperwork showed she'd started renting it about 8 months after my grandfather died, which was strange because she'd always been so adamant about not hoarding things. My parents asked if I could handle clearing it out since they lived 3 states away. I agreed, thinking it would just be some old furniture or keepsakes. The storage facility was about 45 minutes from my apartment, in this industrial area that seemed weirdly deserted even for a Tuesday afternoon. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when I showed her my ID and the death certificate. She just pushed a clipboard toward me with some transfer papers and pointed me toward Unit 217. "It's in the back corner of Building C," she said. "Don't stay past 8. That's when we lock the gates." The facility was massive, row after row of identical beige buildings with roll-up doors. The numbers didn't seem to follow any logical order, and I spent nearly 20 minutes wandering through the maze of corridors before finding Building C. The whole time, I didn't see another person, which I found increasingly unsettling. These places usually have at least a few people moving things in or out. Unit 217 was exactly where she said it would be, the back corner. I noticed immediately that it was one of the larger units, which didn't make sense. Why would my grandmother, who lived in a modest 2-bedroom house, need such a large storage space? I had to use both hands to lift the heavy padlock that secured the door. It looked newer than I expected, shiny compared to the slightly rusted door. When I rolled up the door, I was hit with the musty smell of enclosed space and old papers. The unit was nearly empty except for a single item in the center, a large, antique wooden wardrobe that I recognized from my grandparents' house. It had always been in their bedroom, and I remembered being fascinated by the intricate carvings on the doors as a child. My grandfather had told me it was a family heirloom from the old country brought over by his great-grandparents. I stood there confused. Why would she rent such a large unit just for this one piece of furniture? And why hide it away here instead of keeping it at home or selling it? As I approached the wardrobe, I noticed something odd. Despite the unit being clearly undisturbed for some time, there was a thin layer of dust on the floor around the wardrobe. There were no cobwebs or dust on the wardrobe itself. It looked polished, maintained. I reached for the brass handle and I swear the metal felt warm to the touch. Not cool like you'd expect in the unheated storage unit. When I pulled the door open, I was relieved to find it empty. Just hanging rods and a single drawer at the bottom. I knelt down to check the drawer, thinking there might be some explanation inside. Maybe letters or photos that would explain why my grandmother kept this piece isolated here. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing nothing but a small leather-bound book that looked like a journal. I sat on the concrete floor and opened it. The first page simply said, "Henrik's Notes," in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The next several pages were filled with what looked like research, references to old folklore books, sketched symbols I didn't recognize, and names of places I'd never heard of. About halfway through, the neat handwriting changed, becoming more urgent and slanted. "It's happening again. The dreams are back. I see them standing at the foot of our bed, watching Mary, always watching her. I've reinforced the bindings, but I don't know how long they'll hold. The wardrobe needs to be moved. It can't stay in our house anymore." The next entries became increasingly disturbing. My grandfather described hearing scratching sounds from inside the wardrobe at night. He wrote about finding the doors open in the morning when he was certain he'd locked them the night before. There were rambling passages about thin places and doors that shouldn't be opened. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before his sudden heart attack, read, "I've found someone who understands." He says it can't be destroyed, but it can be contained. The binding ritual must be performed monthly. Mary knows what to do if something happens to me. God forgive me for burdening her with this, but there's no one else. I felt cold all over despite the stuffy air in the unit. My grandfather had always been a practical, no-nonsense kind of man. He'd been an engineer his whole life, dealing in facts and measurements. This delusional, superstitious writing seemed completely out of character. I closed the journal and stood up, suddenly feeling uncomfortable being alone with the wardrobe. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A thin line of salt surrounding the wardrobe in a perfect circle, almost invisible against the concrete floor. I decided I'd come back tomorrow with my truck and a friend to help move the wardrobe. I could look through the journal more carefully at home. As I turned to leave, I heard a distinct sound from behind me, the soft click of a latch. I spun around to see that the wardrobe door, which I was certain I had closed, was now open just a crack. Heart pounding, I quickly crossed the room and shut it firmly, convincing myself it must have swung open because the unit wasn't perfectly level. As I locked up the storage unit, I resolved to call my parents that evening and ask if they knew anything about this wardrobe or why Grandma would keep it here. But when I got home and pulled out my phone to call them, I discovered the journal was no longer in my pocket. I emptied my pockets, checked my car, even looked through the clothes I'd been wearing, but it was gone. I called my mother anyway, casually asking if she remembered the old wardrobe from her in-laws' bedroom. "What wardrobe?" she asked. "Your grandparents never had a wardrobe in their bedroom. Your grandfather hated old furniture. He always wanted everything modern and functional." I felt my blood run cold. I distinctly remembered that wardrobe from my childhood visits. I remembered hiding inside it during games of hide and seek with my cousins. I remembered my grandfather telling me stories about it. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "The big wooden one with the carvings?" "In their bedroom?" "Honey, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, sounding concerned. "They had a plain dresser and closet, never any wardrobe." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling increasingly uneasy. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with questions. The next morning, I drove back to the storage facility determined to get some answers and to retrieve the journal if it had somehow fallen out of my pocket there. But when I arrived, the woman at the desk looked at me with confusion when I mentioned Unit 217. "We don't have a unit with that number," she said, checking her computer. "Building C only goes up to Unit 190. "That's impossible," I insisted. "I was just there yesterday. I have the paperwork right here." I pulled out the transfer papers I'd signed. She examined them with a frown. "Sir, these aren't our forms, and we don't have any record of a Mary Kellman ever renting a unit here." I felt like I was losing my mind. I convinced her to let me look for myself, and she reluctantly agreed, probably just to get rid of me. I practically ran to where Building C had been the day before, but in its place was just an empty lot, fenced off and filled with construction materials. I returned to the office, demanding answers, but she just looked at me like I was crazy. "That area's been under construction for the new building for months," she said. "No one's been back there." I left the facility feeling disoriented and scared. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I had somehow gone to the wrong storage facility, that I had imagined or misremembered things, but deep down, I knew what I had seen and experienced. A week later, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was the leather journal I had found in the wardrobe. A yellow sticky note was attached to the cover with a message written in shaky handwriting that didn't belong to anyone I knew. "You opened it. Now it's your responsibility. Salt must be refreshed monthly. Never open after midnight." "I'm sorry." That night I woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the distinct sound of wood creaking. At the foot of my bed stood the wardrobe that should have been locked away in a storage unit that apparently never existed. Its doors were open just a crack, and from inside came the sound of something breathing. I moved the next day, left most of my things behind and just drove until I felt far enough away. But I took the journal with me, and I've been researching, trying to understand what my grandfather discovered and what my grandmother had been quietly dealing with all those years alone. I still have the wardrobe, not in my apartment. I'm not crazy. I've rented a storage unit for it in a facility with 24-hour security cameras. I refresh the Salt Circle monthly just like the note said. I never visit after dark, but here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Last time I went to check on it, the security guard mentioned how nice it was that I visited so regularly. Not many people come twice in 1 week, he said. When I told him I hadn't been there since the previous month, he looked confused and pulled up the security footage. The cameras clearly showed someone who looked exactly like me entering my unit 3 days earlier, staying for nearly an hour, and then leaving. The cameras didn't show what came out with him.